In this video, I'll show you how hackers can maintain persistence and even potentially escalate their privileges inside of an Entra ID or Microsoft 365 environment. Now to get started, first I want to set up our environment. So I'll open up the Entra ID tenant in my web browser Firefox. That is at the usual Microsoft Online login at login.microsoftonline.com. And from there, I'll go ahead and log in as the M365 admin or the global administrator for this tenant. This was a developer tenant that I had created previously in another video, just qfz0.onmicrosoft.com. So I'll sign in here, enter my password. I will need to do some multi-factor authentication work, approving the sign in, and now I can log in. Now, bear in mind, I'm logging in as the global administrator just to set up the environment so that we actually have a low privilege user that we could compromise, the victim or a target to gain initial access into this tenant. Now to set that up, I'll need to go to the Entra ID admin management portal. And if you don't know the URL or that location in the address bar to go to, because there are a lot of them in Microsoft infrastructure, look, I do want to show this sweet little resource to you, msportals.io. This is an awesome whole library, archive, and catalog, including all the links for different locations that, hey, Microsoft has available all online for Azure, Entra ID, Microsoft 365, and Office apps, tons and tons of these. So, hey, hope that's a sweet resource for you, msportals.io. But what we want, if I control F4 that Microsoft Entra Admin Center, there it is at simple entra.microsoft.com. And now that I am at the Entra ID Admin Center, and I can manage this tenant, look, I am just going to simply add that new user in the users section. I'll go into the all users and you can see that currently I am logged in as just the M365 admin, which I have the name set for global administrator. Collapsing this over on the left-hand side, you can see that email address as expected, but let me create a new user, and with that, we can just create a little victim. That will be a simple low privilege user, and we can call it that with its display name. We will need to supply a password, but we can make it something that is not auto-generated, but easy enough as a temporary password for us to remember. And with that, we could simply review, create, and build out the account. No, don't need to save that password, but now we have a low privilege victim user that we can compromise. Now, if I were to refresh this users page, you should be able to see, after I go ahead and collapse that left-hand sidebar menu again, we do have our low privilege user, the victim, created and easy enough for us to work with. And we will move pretty quick through the initial access attack vector because that's not really the focus of this video. Remember, I wanted to talk about persistence and potentially privilege escalation. But this comes with a little bit of nuance because this is talking and working with groups in Entra ID. And groups are organizational units to handle different users, but there are two different kinds of groups in Entra ID. There are M365 or Microsoft 365 groups to work with and have access to different applications like Teams, SharePoint, whatever, and security groups that give a little bit more fine-grained control to work with resources and computational devices, stuff like that. In fact, if you take a look at the Microsoft documentation, they obviously will do a better job explaining it than I do, but hey, they cover really everything that I just mentioned. The two different types of groups are security groups and Microsoft 365 groups. Now, there are interesting different types of membership within these groups. You could have assigned groups where you specifically add specific users as members of the group, but there are also dynamic groups, and these are really interesting. It's like you can automatically set up rules or criteria to automatically pull in a user to that group. On another page of the documentation, they do specifically cover managing those rules for dynamic groups in Entra ID, and there is one important thing that I do have to tell you here. Look, this feature, this functionality does require a Microsoft ID P1 or premium license. So we will need to have a subscription. Now, for this demo and little sandbox and learning environment, I've just rolled through a quick and easy 30-day free trial just for our learning, but I still think this is pretty plausible in the real world for a real tenant. So let's look back at our groups and think about what a compromised user could see or access by simply being joined into any of these groups, or maybe we, as our penetration penetration tester, ethical hacker here could add a backdoor account, a whole nother user that could potentially join other groups. In fact, some group types in Entra ID are joinable by all users by default. But for this showcase, let's talk about those dynamic groups, because there's some really interesting stuff to play with there. Let me create a new group, and this will have the default type of security. We could have whatever group name that we wanted to, and we could toggle the membership type to a dynamic user group. Let's say some department or some roles, maybe it's security team, IT team, or just for the sake of simplicity, we could say administrators could be created with whatever description that we want. Let's add an owner here. We could just simply add our global administrator, that M365 admin that we've been working with. We will need to go ahead and create the actual rule or the query for this dynamic group. So we could add a dynamic query, and this is kind of cool. We actually get to build out the logic that defines what is the criteria for any user to automatically be pulled into and added to this group. You could add however many logical expressions and or operations that you would like. I can clear this out with the trash bin that I know my face is covering up, forgive me. Or we could actually just toggle any properties or information about the users that we could actually filter on to determine, hey, does it actually match the criteria of starting with, have, contains, in, be a part of, or whatever. And we could just simply add and type the syntax here. There is at the very far right, again, my face covering it, an edit rule button that will allow us to edit the rule syntax. Now, I will simply create the condition where the user.user principal name, which is like their email address in this scenario, right? Tac or dash minus whatever you want, contains admin. So just a small, simple, stupid rule where, look, if you just happen to have admin in your username, you are likely an admin and should be appropriately added to the admins group. You could see some examples down here, but we could go ahead and click OK, add that, and let's save to make sure this works. Go ahead and create that group. That will be created for us. And now if I were to refresh this page for the groups, we should very well be able to see our new dynamic group and the actual automatic capability to add users in to the administrators group. Now, I know I'm not adding any permissions or capability to this. This is all just for our learning. But hey, honestly, this whole dynamic group abuse is actually something that's covered in some of the sweet training available by Altered Security. And by the way, they are doing their Black Friday deal right now. So if you wanted some ethical hacking, penetration testing, red teaming, training, education, exercises, lab environments, certifications, and so much more, you can get 20% off on all courses and boot camps, all from Altered Security. Let me tell you about them. Altered Security. The best way to learn cybersecurity is through hands-on and practical exercises, and having a challenge, something to prove your competency and merit, so the industry knows you're a professional. From the brains behind Nishang and so many other offensive tools, Nikhil Mittal and team brings you Altered Security, with affordable, easy-to-access, and stable cybersecurity training labs. Get certified in on-premise red teaming Active Directory exploitation with their well-known training for CRTP, the Certified Red Team Professional. You can hack Active Directory certificate services with their CESP exam, or level up to become an expert and master with CRTE and CRTM. Tired of on-premise instances? Tackle the cloud with Azure Red Teaming courses like CARTP and CAWASP. On top of that, a number of these trainings are also available as live online training boot camps. Altered Security offers some of the most recognizable certifications and top-tier training in the industry. You can get started learning and sharpening your security skills with my link below in the video description, jh.live/altered security. Huge thanks to Altered Security for sponsoring this video. Alright, now that we have finished setting up our environment, we can finally go on the offense and hop over to our Kali Linux virtual machine where we will act as the attacker. So I'll log in here with Kali, I'll open up a terminal for us to work with, but truthfully, I want to get started with a new tool that I don't think I've got a chance to showcase before, but it is incredible. If you aren't familiar, Graph Runner is a sweet capability put together by Daft Hack or Bo Bullock, and it is a post-exploitation toolkit for interacting with the Microsoft Graph API. We can go take a look on GitHub here, and credit where credit is due. It looks like a couple other contributors were Steve Borosh, Reverse Shell, and a lot of other incredible folks. But check it out. Graph Runner actually automates all the same stuff that you do, and you've seen me clicking around in like the web interface and graphical user interface for our Microsoft 365, the Entra ID tenant, but it's all working with the API. With that, you get to do some really sweet stuff, and it's all in a weaponized, at least automated and streamlined fashion. It is a PowerShell tool. So we'll get to do this within PowerShell, but quick and easy, still something we can do within Linux because I do have that cross-platform capability now. So let me clone this repository, get it back into our terminal. I like to leave some tools within the op directory, and with that, we'll clone this down. And I'll move into that directory, start up PowerShell with pwsh, and we can simply // our graphrunner.ps1 script. Now you get this cool ASCII art. Hey, Bo Bullock's incredible tool, Graph Runner. I do love the Blade Runner references, or at least all this sweet stuff. Do service principals dream of electric sheep? Now this has an awesome arsenal of functions, modules, things we can run within PowerShell. All we need to do to actually take a look at that is list Graph Runner modules. All these commandlets are now in scope since we imported that with that dot syntax. And take a look. The actual Graph Runner module, at least the kind of fire the gun, run everything tooling, is just simple, invoke Graph Runner. And that will do all of the other little subcomponents or things that you could still run manually as you would like, but get security groups, dump the conditional access policy, take a look at other applications that are installed, search mailboxes, search SharePoint, search OneDrive, invoke actually searching through Microsoft Teams, so much cool stuff, and they all have these individual modules to do all those things just as well. Pillage the village, a little bit of persistence, a little bit of privilege escalation, recon enumeration, and of course, actually getting our initial access. Now, we've showcased this technique when we're using the device code fish in a previous video, but hey, Graph Runner makes this super streamlined and easy just as well. So for us to get our access, if you don't mind, we'll do a little bit of suspended disbelief. Hey, we're gonna streamline that process of phishing the user, but all we need to do is just, hey, use this get graph tokens command line that will tell us, look, you can use the device code fish where we're using a device login from the real legitimate actual Microsoft.com, but they'll just enter this device code as if they were authenticating one specific tool or device, really. Like, think of it in like smart televisions. I don't know, you try to sign into Amazon or Netflix, you get that idea. So back on our Windows side, now from the victim perspective, right? Play pretend victim. Say that we fell for a phishing email, we were fooled by some social engineering. I'll open up another Firefox web browser, this time a private session, so we don't have any of the cookies left over and dangling. And let me navigate to that device login page on Microsoft. Again, say that we clicked on this in a phishing email, we were bamboozled by whatever, scheme and little pretense that was put together in some little charade and facade here. We can paste in that device code as we were told to. Once I click next, we'll work through a real legitimate sign-in. That should be the victim, the low privilege account that we are fooling in this case to gain our initial access. For the tenant qfz0.onmicrosoft.com, we can click next and now enter the password that we had prepared for that account. And this is the first time that that account is logging in, so we will need to actually set a new password for it. That's totally fine. If the account had never been signed in before, it will prompt you to set up multi-factor authentication. We don't need to in this case, but of course, if you actually had MFA set up, it would prompt the user to go through that entire process. Not necessary for just our learning. Yes, we do want to sign in, and now you may very well be able to see over on the left-hand side for our attacker machine, we got all of the information. We have successfully authenticated as the low privilege victim user as they fell for our scheme and social engineering. We've gained access to their tokens and their session to continue to work and interact with the Microsoft Graph API and do everything we might do in Entra ID. But bear in mind, this is just a low privilege account. It's not a global administrator like we started with. So what could we do? Well, you saw everything from that list graph runner modules option previously. There's a whole lot of sweet stuff we might be able to do, but as I want to focus us in on, hey, the groups that we might work with, they do have some sweet capability to just get security groups. That will simply enumerate and list out security groups and members. Nothing wrong with that. We could simply get dash security groups, and if I hit enter without any arguments, it will tell us, hey, you need the tokens. You need to actually supply the tokens and the authenticated access that we just got with the device code fish. Now we already have these. These are staged and set up in a variable within our PowerShell session. But if you did not supply those, it'll ask you, hey, do you want to authenticate now? Just in case you hadn't already. We can just Control-C out of this though and add in that TAC tokens and the $ tokens variable that GraphRunner has already populated for us with everything that it retrieved from that fish just a moment ago. Now, when I hit enter on this, it'll pull down and actually grab all of the groups that it's tracking down inside the tenant. You could see everything that we saw just in the web interface, including our administrators group. Some other sweet capability of GraphRunner, we could try to find updatable groups. We could query that again with tokens. We'll add those in. I am awful at forgetting that. Now it'll try to grab all these and see what it might be able to access. And hey, by default, looks like our account, the low privilege, still could make some changes here. But I am most interested in those dynamic groups. And of course, GraphRunner has a cool convenience function for that. Let's try to get dynamic groups. And this will interrogate, okay, tokens again, thank you. And if you ever see Graph API telling you like, oh, hang on, you just got a little bit of rate limit stuff, it might be a little bit finicky, but you can just run it again. Let it try a couple more times. We can hit enter a little bit here and there, and it should still eventually come through. And take a look. We've got our administrators group that it knows is a dynamic group, and it can even track down the membership role so we can see the condition that maybe we could meet and then either escalate privileges, gaining new capability within that group, or, hey, just hide and smuggle in maybe a whole nother user like that backdoored account and persistence for our campaign and our activity. And that gets us thinking, though. We could not add a new user as a low privilege user, right? We don't have that capability. We're not a global admin, but we could invite a guest. By default, fun fact, all members of Entra ID can invite guests, external guests, which could have any email address. And what if we could just put together our own cheeky little email address that does contain admin? Now, even as our attacker, I can open up a simple web browser and go to, I don't know, just any throwaway like 10-minute mail or equivalent temporary email address. And I found that minuteinbox.com will actually let us choose our own totally custom edited name for the email address that we'd like. Looks like it always uses like moneychair.org as the end, but that's fine. If we click edit, we could do something stupid like, I don't know, securityadmin@moneychair.org. We can confirm this, and now we've got that email address. So here's the coolest thing. Let me put these side by side so you should be able to see them easily enough. Back over in our terminal, once again, GraphRunner has an easy and convenient invoke invite guest commandlet. We can supply the tokens, I remembered this time, and it'll ask us, enter the email address you'd like to invite. And we can use our securityadmin@moneychair.org. Enter the display name. I don't know, we could call this our attacker. Enter the redirect URI. Doesn't really matter. You can leave blank to use the default. If you want to send an email invitation, we can enter true here. And if you wanted to supply a custom message, a little bit more for your phish or social engineering campaign, we can leave that blank, and it will then send an email using Microsoft, right? Genuinely telling Microsoft to invite this guest to this tenant, and it'll give us a invite redeem URL, which maybe we could use just on our own if we were staging this a little bit more. But if I go back to our left-hand side for our 10-minute mail minute inbox, hey, I can refresh this and take a look. Microsoft has invited you to this tenant. Of course, if you were to read this in like Gmail or Outlook or a totally normal client, this would look a little bit better, but we could just as easily accept the invitation. This is our attacker perspective, right? Like we don't need any extra permissions or stuff set up. Then Microsoft will just send us a code again to the inbox that we can control. We'll go back to Minute Inbox, take a look, see if we have any new messages, and I'll refresh this page with F5. There we do. Our account verification code, whatever, 41185, doesn't matter. We can go slap this in and then just be joined and invited to the tenant. We have now our backdoor account. And after we accept this, because we're meeting that criteria of admin being in the user principal name per that dynamic rule, then we're automatically added to this administrators group or whatever other group might very well have that dynamic query and rule attached to it. If you wanted to set up an authenticator, MFA, you totally could. In this case, again, we don't need to, just for our learning, but take a look. Back over here, I can full screen this. If we wanted to see now our access, if I open up the little hamburger menu here, or no, it's under My Apps, we can go to My Account, and as this page loads, our attacker, backdoor, security admin, feedback to Microsoft, extremely satisfied, thank you. Take a look at My Groups down over here. Feedback again, okay, I'm still extremely satisfied, nothing has changed, thank you. Groups I am in, we do have one, the administrators group. Now, I know what you're saying. I know there's not any special permissions or privileges set up with this, but the point still stands. For one thing, you can invite, if with a compromised Entra ID user, any other guest to the tenant. That guest might start with low privileges, but as it's added into other groups, then it will gain a little bit more access and capability. And there's still some other sweet stuff that we can do with Graph Runner. If we hop back to our attacker terminal, remember, we were listing out all the Graph Runner modules and what we might be able to do. There's a ton of interesting stuff here, but in the persistence section, look, you could inject a whole app, like a rogue app that we've showcased in like the illicit consent grant attack video, or we could totally clone an entire security group and fake it so that it looks like something duplicative or just a little bit confusing, as groups could very well be nested and memberships could be all over the place in a huge, ginormous Entra ID tenant, which may very well be what you could be up against. So take a look at how we could add some confusion and create an entirely new security group that copies all of the other users in a normal group and then puts them in a rogue malicious group that potentially, maybe a sysadmin legitimately adds to or gives new privileges and permissions to, even by mistake, because we could make it look a little bit sneaky. Let me show you this. Hey, let me invoke security group cloner. Let's add our tokens as usual. Remember, we're still operating as our low privilege user. And now we could actually see all the groups that it has found. And look, enter a group name that you want to clone. Well, our administrators group very well has the actual global admin and the security admin money share external guest that we've added. So why not try to clone the administrators or something that could cause more chaos and confusion? Do you want to add your current user to that clone group? Yeah, we could add our low privilege compromised account. Totally, that's awesome. Do you want to add a different user to the clone group? Well, we have our backdoor security admin at MoneyShare, but we don't need to particularly add him because he's already in what would be the contents of the cloned group. We can say, no, we don't need to add it. Do you want to change the group name? Now this is where it kind of gets a little bit clever. Administrators is the original name, but there's nothing stopping you from having another group with the exact same name. So, yes. No, I want to keep it the same. We do not need to change the name, entering no, and there we go. Kept the name administrators, created an entirely new administrators group, and that's got its own ID that we could see out and about. Now, obviously, from our attacker perspective, getting back into Firefox, if I were to refresh this page, we'll see that our backdoored account is now in both administrators groups. And if I were to momentarily bring us back to the Windows perspective, say I'm the system administrator or that global admin here, if I were to get back to the Entra ID Admin Center, look, taking a look at the groups as we expand this out, over on that left-hand section, all groups, obviously, you'll see both administrators there. And that's not confusing at all, totally, right? If the tenant maintainers and actual administrators were to, at some point, make some changes to permissions or privileges or roles or users or groups or whatever, and suddenly they were to just add a new user to these groups, administrators, or you could create as many of these clone confusing tidbits if you wanted to, there's nothing that might stop them if they're just thinking, hey, I don't know what's the right one, let me just add it to both, all of the above. So there. A couple of the different quirks of Entra ID and Microsoft 365 that could be leveraged for persistence and potentially privilege escalation. Because look, by default, any user can invite guests. And by default, some group types could very well be joinable by any user. Or users can, by default, create security groups and therefore clone and add confusion to what is already in the environment and pollute the entire tenant. Now, if you aren't on the offense, having your hacker hat on, doing penetration testing and all, look, if you're trying to defend from this and harden, lock things down a little bit in the Entra Admin Center, you can simply search for the user settings. And this option here will allow you to toggle, okay, a little bit of the users can create security groups. You could toggle that off. Guest user access restrictions, you probably don't need to have any of the capabilities for those guest users, so you can make that restricted, toggle this, and if you wanted to, actually explore the external user section that has the manage external collaboration settings. On this page, you could say, okay, guest user access, again, restricted, and the invite settings, again, by default, anyone in the org can invite external guests and collaborators. Trying to lock that down, maybe set that no one in the organization needs to be able to do that, or only folks with those specific admin roles can invite guests. But by default, probably doesn't need to have anyone being able to do that. And that is the gist. Now, I know there are a whole lot of these cloud configurations and settings and switches and default setup that may or may not be really what you want. So it's worthwhile to know all those things, or at least collect them and, hey, add to your knowledge. So I hope you do, hey, maybe learn a little bit more, get some of the sweet training, take a look at some of the certifications, courses, and curriculum from Altered Security. They're another sweet resource to learn a whole lot of this Entra ID, Azure Active Directory, Microsoft 365, hacking, both using the offense and, hey, using that for defense just as well. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please do give some love to our sponsors. There is a link in the video description. Genuinely, they're the only way this channel can keep doing what it's doing, and I super appreciate their support and yours. Please do all those YouTube algorithm things, like, comment, subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.